Good morning. Thank you for joining us again. Today our questions mostly concern 123 rear axles and drive lines. And they come from a gentleman in Cocoa, Florida with a 1984 300 TD station wagon. Richard has been experiencing a clanking noise when he lets off the accelerator and a vibration from 0 to 20 miles an hour, and also when the transmission changes from first to second gear. These vibrations are actually pretty common for a 123 series, and when people start to experience them, I tell them that they should always go underneath the car and look at three components. Component number one is the drive shaft center support. It's a rubber ring that has a metal brace that holds the drive shaft to the body of the car and allows some free movement. If you look at this rubber ring, it can crack, and then the drive shaft starts to vibrate profusely depending on how bad the cracking and separating is. This component is located underneath the car, about 1.5 feet towards the rear of the car from the transmission. It's suspended with two 13mm bolts, and removing it requires removal of the drive shaft. Another issue that Richard is dealing with is this bizarre differential noise. How many of you own 123 diesels or similar cars have experienced a clanking noise letting off of the accelerator from higher speeds? This noise can be anything from a drive shaft noise to a CV noise to a differential noise. The most common problem is a drive shaft noise. This can either be caused by an ailing flex disc, like we mentioned earlier, or a not sufficiently tightened nut that holds the two halves of the drive shaft together. This nut is located just behind the axle support, the drive shaft support that I mentioned. And if the nut gets too loose, then you can get a light clanking noise, especially when you're putting the car into gear or accelerating or decelerating. When you're looking at the CV axles, it's best to check and make sure that the boots aren't ruptured. If the boots are ruptured, it typically means the grease has leaked out of the CV and it has developed excess play in it. These axles can start to make noise when the car is driving at high speeds after a prolonged period of time, when you're decelerating or accelerating, and also when you're driving at very low speeds. Usually the noises are very soft and it takes some effort to hear them, but when they start to get bad, a profuse knocking from the rear of the car will originate. Once this knocking begins, if your boot is split open, it means that the entire CV joint has become contaminated and needs to be pitched. However, the knocking can start before a boot splits if the CV joint has 200,000 or more miles on it or so and begins to wear. Finally, with the differential, the most important thing to look at is whether or not there's excess play or movement in the rear axles before the differential is even rotating. The drive shaft rotates the rear axles through the differential, and it's very common for excess play to develop on high mileage cars that have not had rear axle services. While repairing and rebuilding a differential can be very difficult, the checking of the rotation of the drive shaft and how much it turns the CV axles is the number one thing you need to inspect. The fortunate thing about differential issues is that they do not develop into worse problems as time goes on. Oftentimes a whiny differential or a differential with a little bit of backlash will stay that way for several 100,000 miles. And it's very, very possible that you won't experience any further issues. I often tell people that if they're having these differential issues and they want to resolve them on their own, their best route is to find a used differential that does not have high mileage on it and does not show excessive play, replace the pinion seal and the axle seals, and install it in the car. Installation is very straightforward and requires the removal of the two CV shafts and the drive shaft. 4 bolts that hold the differential to the subframe in the rear of the car, and the front mount for the differential. Other than that, your drive line on the 123s is nearly bulletproof. Following these steps should help you diagnose any drive shaft noises, any vibrations, or any odd behaviors in your rear axles, your differential, or your drive shaft. Thank you so much for listening today. Please like us. Please send us your questions. We love getting them, and enjoy driving your Mercedes-Benz.